If you want to understand the middle and end to a story, you must first understand the beginning. What follows are my initial thoughts and reactions to this book of the Bible. I have not done any outside research regarding the more challenging or problematic passages of Christian scripture. Therefore, do not take whatever criticisms I may make in this video as my final word on the passage or verse in question. I am very likely going to be doing a Bible Revisited series addressing my different issues with the Bible, book by book, after conducting ample outside research. So now, without further ado, let's jump into the review. Alright, so now we have finally gotten to the very beginning of the Bible. We started in Matthew, read the entire New Testament, and now we are at Genesis. It's about time we got to the Old Testament, and we kind of did a little reverse order, went new and then old. To sum up my overall thoughts on the book of Genesis, it was a really fascinating book. I didn't realize how long it was compared to a lot of the New Testament books, but it's significantly longer than a lot of the New Testament books. It's not a bad thing. I will say that it took me a while to get gripped by the book of Genesis, because I've heard a lot of the stories before, like obviously like Adam and Eve and Abraham, and all that stuff. I've heard a lot of these stories before, but about towards like halfway through the book, obviously the story of Noah and everything, like I'd heard all that before. But about like halfway through the book, I really started to get gripped, particularly with the story of Jacob and Esau and the story of Joseph. And while I'm familiar with all the stories in the book of Genesis, I've read the book of Genesis before a long time ago. Now revisiting it, just as an older person, being able to understand things better. I will say, like, this book really, the whole thing in the end really grabbed me, and I really found Genesis to be very interesting, very challenging at times. I will say there are a couple things you can skip over, like when it lists genealogy, names and stuff. Like that stuff was a little, I just kind of grazed over it. Overall, I really loved the book of Genesis. I enjoyed it a lot more than I thought it would. Like, I will say, this whole thing of like reading each book of the Bible and then critiquing, or like going through it and looking for things that I really find to be beautiful and powerful, and then also finding things that I find to be very problematic and challenging. Reading it that way allows me to really get far more out of reading the book, because I know that I have to report it to you guys. And so reading Genesis, because my memories of reading the Old Testament before was not much. Like, I've read the entire Old Testament before, but I just got bored and I didn't really grasp a whole lot of it, because I was just kind of trying to get through it. But this way, reading it this way, I'm focused on being able to give you my thoughts on the book, and I don't want to look like an idiot, so I'm like really paying attention to what's written on the page. And I will say, like, I'm really glad I paid attention to what was written on the page of Genesis, because it was very powerful. So those were my brief thoughts and feelings on the book of Genesis, just how it overall affected me, and like how I thought about it as I read it. But now I want to get into the actual analysis and discussion part of this review, because there are a number of verses and passages that I want to talk about that I think are very important, both important to talk about because they're powerful, and also some of them are a little bit challenging and a little unclear. So anyways, let's go ahead and jump into that portion of this review. So I'm not going to touch much on the story of Adam and Eve, although, it is obviously one of the oldest stories ever known to mankind, so definitely worth reading. But pretty much everyone knows the story, so I'm not really gonna go through it necessarily. But there are a couple things that I do want to talk about. There's one verse in particular. This is Genesis chapter 2, verse 18. This spoke to me because I don't know, being a young male college student who does not have a girlfriend, this definitely spoke to me. Verse 18, chapter 2. The Lord God said, "It is not good for the man to be alone. Yeah. Now, the other passage I want to talk about regarding Adam and Eve, well, this isn't the only passage, but one of the other passages that I want to talk about is Genesis chapter 3, verses 6 through 7. And it reads, "When the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye, and also desirable for gaining wisdom, she took some and ate it. She also gave some to her husband, who was with her, and he ate it. Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they realized they were naked. So they sewed fig leaves together and made coverings for themselves." Now, the reason I point out this passage is, everyone always blame, some people say that the Bible in this particular story is like condemning Eve. And it's pretty clear that the Bible, and in the next passage that we'll talk about, condemns both Adam and Eve. But in this passage, it also, it says she took some and ate it. She also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate it. So both of them were deceived by the serpent. I just wanted to point that out because I know a lot of people are always like, well, why is it like it's all, or even some people are like, it's all the woman's fault. It's like, no, Adam was there too. Going along with that last passage, later in Genesis chapter 3, verses 16 through 19, we see the kind of punishment that is awarded to both Adam and Eve for both their wrongdoings, just to, I guess, back up that point I was trying to make just a second ago. And this passage, of course, reads, "To the woman he said, I will greatly increase your pains in childbearing. With pain you will give birth to children. Your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. To Adam he said, because you listened to your wife and ate from the tree about which I commanded you, you must not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil you will eat of it all the days of your life. It will produce thorns and thistles for you, and you will eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your brow you will eat your food until you return to the ground, since from it you were taken. For dust you are, and to dust you will return." Now, what I think is really interesting about this passage is the sort of penalties that are awarded to each of the sexes. And I think it's safe to say that both are penalized here for the sin of eating from the tree. The woman, it's childbearing, like the pain of it, and that's the punishment, and also a fierce desire for your husband to the point where your husband almost has, at least the way I read this, it's almost like the husband has power over the woman because of her desire for him. That's what I almost feel like the punishment is in some way there. And then with the husband, the punishment is hard freaking work that will break you. Now, you may not, agree with the sentiments expressed here in these passages, and that's fine or whatever. But I think it's important to point that out. This point that both Adam and Eve were punished. You may not think justly, or you may think justly. It doesn't really matter for the purpose of this conversation. But I do think this is important to point out that both Adam and Eve were punished, and neither punishment is a fun ride. Now, the next passage I want to talk about is kind of mysterious, and I've got some thoughts on it. It's very interesting. Like, one of the trees that's also in the Garden of Eden was the tree of life. And the idea is that if you eat of it, you can live forever. I think it's very interesting that both the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil are in the same garden, and they both end up being like forbidden trees. To take you to a children's book written by C.S. Lewis kind of expressed his thoughts on this particular idea in his book, The Magician's Nephew, where Aslan, the lion, who's basically God, tests Diggory, and I think the other character's name was Jill. Basically, he tests them with a similar, it's kind of an allegory to the story of Adam and Eve, of you can't eat from this particular tree. In that book, C.S. Lewis was almost saying the story of Adam and Eve, the stories of like forbidding eating of this fruit, isn't that this stuff is like will be forbidden for you forever. It's almost as if God, by saying you can't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life, it's almost as if he's testing Adam and Eve to see what they'll do. And perhaps if they had followed his instructions, he would have later revealed to them and allowed them to eat of these trees. But since they didn't, God can't trust them. And in this verse passage, Genesis chapter 3, verse 21 to 22, it reads, "The Lord God made garments of skin for Adam and his wife and clothed them. And the Lord God said, 'The man has now become like one of us, knowing good and evil. He must not be allowed to reach out his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat and live forever.'" I kind of feel like C.S. Lewis was right in his little children's book about, I think God had plans to allow Adam and Eve to one day eat from that tree of the knowledge of good and evil and eat of the tree of life. But since they failed the first test and they ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, he said, "No, you are now you have chosen your path, and God forbids the eating of the tree of life." But I feel like at some point, like if humanity hadn't made that fatal mistake, things would have been better. I don't know, that's just my thoughts on what that story is supposed to mean. Incest. What do you think of it? You weren't expecting that now, were you? Now, it's interesting what we're about to talk about here. Very weird subject, but I think we gotta talk about it, because this is definitely one of those things in the Bible where you're like, this doesn't make too much sense. This is kind of this makes Christians probably uncomfortable to talk about. And while yes, I am a Christian, I am also a skeptical person. And this is one of those things where I'm like, this is weird. You gotta talk about it. It appears that in the Bible, there may have been some incest early on. There definitely was incest early on. And while it's interesting in the book of Genesis, God doesn't seem to condemn it. He also doesn't seem to condone it, but it does happen. And it does happen to people that God helps and seems to like. And I don't know. It's kind of a weird thing. And I want to read a verse where this is probably a case of incest. This is Genesis chapter 4, verse 17. "Cain lay with his wife, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Enoch." This is kind of weird because, remember, Adam and Eve gave birth to Cain and Abel. And at this junction, there are no other people who are around. And so who was Cain's wife? It's a good question. Now, some people think perhaps God made other people elsewhere in the world. There's no textual evidence of this. It's possible. I've always thought this was a weird subject because I know that later in the Bible it does condemn things like incest and polygamy, and there's also polygamy mentioned. Like a bunch of these different people in the book of Genesis had multiple wives, and so it's like, and while I say like it's true that like it doesn't seem like God ever is like, this is a good thing, this is a noble a way of living, he also never condemns it. There's a lack of opinion on it. So I don't know how to feel about the incest and polygamy in the Old Testament, other than that it's wrong. And we know that it is condemned as wrong later. I don't know, it brings up the question of, does morality evolve over time in the Bible? And if it does, how do we know that? How does that make sense? I don't know. I just think it's an interesting thought for Christian skeptics, everybody, to think about with regards to the Bible. What is the verdict? I mean, I hope that by the end of me reading the Old Testament, I will have a better understanding, and I'm sure I will. But I need to look into it on myself, like, you know, freaking look up YouTube videos, being like, why does it seem that incest and polygamy are accepted practices in ancient biblical times, whereas they are not later? You know, I'm sure there are great answers out there. I just haven't really looked for them. But for the purposes of this, review, it's weird, and I don't know how to feel about it. And now we're going to move on. Jumping to Genesis chapter 6, I got to say the mention of the Nephilim in verse 4. It says, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of men and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. Very mysterious. I don't know what any of that means. As I understand it, the Nephilim were kind of like very big people, possibly like 9-footers, a bunch of Yao Mings running around. He wasn't 9 feet, but, close enough. That whole idea of the Nephilim, did they exist? Did they not exist? I don't know. According to the Bible, they did. But very mysterious. There's not a whole lot more detail. There's just a casual mention here and there throughout the Bible of them. I'd love to learn more, though. I don't know. I just thought I'd touch on that for a second. I'm not really going to touch on the story of Noah or on the Tower of Babel, because most people know those stories, and nothing that I'm going to say is going to be new on those, I don't think. There are a lot of people, they read the Bible as if it is the direct history book of all history ever of this time. And this is an example where that cannot be. I do think a lot of the Old Testament and the New Testament, I think the Old Testament is probably a mix of both real events and stories to illustrate truths. You can't tell here and there. I think the New Testament is very literal. And I think the Old Testament is literal too, but I think it's definitely a mix. But there are a lot of people, like the people that think that the earth is like 6,000 years old. They almost read it as if all of the generations that are listed in the book of Genesis are if you count them all out and the earth is only 6,000 years old. I'm like, that doesn't make any sense, because there's clearly a lot of gaps in the Bible's history, and one of them is the land of Egypt just springs up in Abraham's time, and he goes and visits there, even though there's no explanation for how this other land is prospering with all these other different people. All I'm saying is that to the people that basically view this as the only history, I think they're wrong and short-sighted. I think that's the only point I'm trying to make. Moving on, Genesis chapter 14, verses 18 through 20 feature Melchizedek, the king of Salem, and he is a priest of God Most High. He appears in a couple different places in the Bible. Very mysterious. No idea exactly what he is or who he is, but I don't know. I would recommend reading that passage. I'm not going to read it for you, but interesting cat. Genesis chapter 19, verses 6 through 8 is a very interesting passage. So to set this up, Lot, he is trying to protect these two angels that have come to visit him in the city of Sodom and Gomorrah. They are in his house, and there's this band of perverts outside his house who are begging him to give these angels over to him. And I'm just going to read the passage now. Lot went outside to meet them and shut the door behind him and said, "No, my friends, don't do this wicked thing. Look, I have 2 daughters who have never slept with a man. Let me bring them out to you, and you can do what you like with them. But don't do anything to these men, for they have come under the protection of my roof." What? Wow. Lot. Whoa. Now, the reason I bring up this passage is because it was very, very crazy to me when I first read it. I was like, this is insane. This is awful. It is important to note here that this is Lot saying these things. And yes, God loved Lot, but that doesn't mean that Lot's perfect or that God condoned what he said here. I have this Life Application Bible. It has things that somewhat give different perspectives on these passages, and in this one they basically say we don't know what Lot meant by this. He could have meant it literally. He could have meant literally they had no care for his daughters, or he could have meant it as a trick, in that it is presumed that these people that were outside his door were, well, I'll just say a band of homosexuals that wanted to rape these men, and if he sends out his daughters, they're not going to touch them because, well, they don't want to, they don't swing that way. That's one idea for it. Another idea is that he was just afraid and out of his mind and had been so affected by the culture of kind of evil and debauchery going on in Sodom and Gomorrah that he had let his morals become compromised to the point where he would send his daughters out to get raped. That's another perspective. Regardless, this passage is very interesting. Definitely look up some more sophisticated answers for yourself online, but I do think it's very important to note that God never says that this is a good thing. He doesn't end up sending his daughters out, by the way. Another crazy passage I have to touch on, I'm not going to read it, but is the story of Lot and his daughters. Basically, his daughters get Lot drunk twice, drunk to the point where he's silly, and they sleep with him. And Lot is, their father. And so it's wrong. Incest is clearly denounced later in the Bible, but here it doesn't make any condemnation or support. It just kind of recounts some events here. But I don't know. I think that's important. I think it's important to touch on this passage because it's also one of those weird things. I'm not going to touch on this for very long, but the story, I've got to touch on it for a second. Genesis chapter 22, which deals with the story of Abraham and Isaac. Abraham sacrificing his son Isaac. Obviously, it's a very compelling story because what ends up happening is it's all a test. Abraham actually doesn't sacrifice his son Isaac. God just wanted to see what Abraham would do, and Abraham lived up to God's test, and instead of having to sacrifice his son, God provided him with a ram. I don't fully understand the story. I mean, I do to an extent. I've heard several different perspectives on it. Obviously, within this context, it's talking about, living up to God's test, and Abraham does. But I almost feel like also the story is a story about how far will you go in servitude to truth. In the Bible, God is kind of perceived, he is truth, is the idea. And Abraham goes all the way, and luckily God says, no, don't actually go all the way. I just wanted to see if you would go there. And Abraham does, and I think we, especially nowadays when there are people running around claiming to be cats, now we're tested all the time with, will you stand up and say, no, you're not a cat and you need help? Or will you say, yeah, hey, you're a cat, I'll get you a litter box? The story of Abraham almost sacrificing his son, very compelling. Had to touch on it. I'm not really going to touch on the story of Cain and Abel because just about everyone knows it, but obviously it's still worth looking into for yourself because it is, one of those age-old stories. It's the first murder, so it's you got to learn about it. So I definitely recommend that you look into it for yourself. Now we come to a story that was perhaps my favorite, or one of my favorite stories, my second favorite story in the book of Genesis, which is the story of Jacob and Esau. Now, I'll try and give you a little summary, although it's kind of a big story, but Jacob and Esau, they come out, Esau comes out first, but Jacob is holding on to Esau's ankle, and it's the two brothers, the idea is the prophecy, the two brothers will constantly be at each other, and the older will serve the younger. The story kind of eventually starts out with Esau. He's an alpha male. Jacob is not so much, and Esau goes out and hunts some wild game. He comes back, and Jacob's cooking some stew, and long story short, Esau ends up giving up his birthright because he just wants some food. He's exhausted, dying. He's yeah, sure, you'll have my birthright, and eat some stew. So he forsakes his birthright. Later on in the story, Jacob deceives the father Isaac and gets Esau's blessing bestowed upon him. He gets Isaac to give what belonged to Esau to himself, Jacob, and it's deceit. And then the brothers, they flee from each other, and this whole story, it's really dramatic and it's chaotic. But I gotta say, when Jacob and Esau, they come back together at some point, years and years later, and Jacob is terrified Esau. That Esau's going to kill him. That Esau's, been angry his whole life because Jacob fled, and they went their separate ways. But there was this war between them. But what I love so much about the story is Esau forgives Jacob. And he lets bygones be bygones, and they part in peace. And it's a really beautiful story because it's like the first real instance of like forgiveness being shown, and how powerful it can be, and how beautiful it can be. I will say, to go along with that Jacob and Esau story, at one point Jacob goes to work for a man called Laban, who deceives Jacob and ends up tricking Jacob into sleeping with his daughter Leah and marrying her rather than his daughter Rachel, and he has to end up working like a total of like 14 years or something like that for Laban, and Jacob is very upset that he's been deceived and tricked, and it just goes to show, like, hey, what goes around comes around. You're getting a little bit of your own medicine, Jacob. You tricked your brother Esau, and why are you so upset when someone tricks you? I'm not going to read this passage to you, but I highly recommend that you read it. This is Genesis chapter 32, verses 22 through 32. And it's about Jacob wrestling with God. The idea, like, he was wrestling with God and he couldn't see his face, and like all this crazy, it's a crazy little story. Another chapter that I was floored by was Genesis chapter 34, the entire thing. It was the story of Dinah and how she was raped by Shechem, and how, like, it almost seemed like Jacob was going to make a deal with Shechem. Weren't going to be like any real consequences to what Shechem did. And I was like, this is like, Jacob, what are you doing? And then two of Jacob's, I think two of his sons went and slaughtered everyone in that camp. And the reason for doing so was, Jacob said to them, he said to Simeon and Levi, "You have brought trouble on me by making me a stench to the Canaanites and Perizzites, the people living in this land. We are few in number, and if they join forces against me and attack me, I and my household will be destroyed." But they replied, should he have treated our sister like a prostitute? I really like this chapter because it really, it makes you think about what you would do if you had a sister who was raped by somebody that was powerful and who could overpower you and possibly kill all of you. Like, what do? Do you just surrender? Do you just make a deal with the devil and move on? Or do you do what Simeon and Levi did and kill everybody, kill as many people as you can who may not even have been personally responsible, but you just go after them? It's a conflicting little situation because, like, there has to be a consequence, at least for the guy who raped your sister. It's like, it's just one of those things that I'm sure Jacob and all those characters were conflicted by. But I gotta say, I feel more respect for what Simeon and Levi did as far as going after Shechem, just because Shechem definitely deserved it. Everyone else, who died, no. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we will end this book review of the book of Genesis by talking about my favorite story in the entire book, which is the story of Joseph. Many people are familiar with the story of Joseph. It had been a very long time since I had read it, though. And man, is it a powerful story. It is a story that, it really may be one of the best stories in the entire Bible. The way forgiveness and hardship is addressed. Like, literally, Joseph was sold into slavery by his own brothers. For goodness sake, that is pretty awful. And then he rises, to become like a prominent official in Egypt. And years later, they come to him, begging him for help, just as his dreams had predicted. And he tests them to see what kind of character they have and all that sort of stuff. But eventually he reveals that he is their brother, and they're terrified, they're shocked. It's just like the whole story. It's beautiful because Joseph ends up forgiving his brothers and loves them, and it's just like it's one of those revolutionary stories that has had a gigantic impact on the entirety of the world. It was really beautiful. I think I almost cried at one point because I was just like, sometimes when you see these heartwarming things or read these heartwarming things about horrible wrongdoings done to people, and then these people overcome that by forgiving those people that hurt them. It's amazing to read about, to see, and the story of Joseph is full of forgiveness, and it's full of, like, Joseph is like a really good guy. Like, he's a good role model. The only thing in the story of Joseph that was a little odd is the Bible often, at least in the book of Genesis, God doesn't necessarily condone or condemn a lot of things that you definitely think should be condemned. Like, for instance, slavery is something that is in the book of Genesis, and Joseph even enslaves some people that were begging, but they're begging to be enslaved. They're begging for him to buy them and buy their land so that they can eat food in Egypt because there's a famine going on. And it's just one of those things where, yes, that's the way things were done at that time, but like, there's no designation for whether or not that was a good thing for Joseph to do or not. I think given the circumstances of the famine, I guess so, but slavery also just feels like to me like an inherently wrong thing. That was the only thing where I was like, I don't know how to feel about all this. It's strange. It's challenging. The story of Joseph was the highlight of the entire book of Genesis. There was something in there for, like, everyone. Like, there's even the story about Joseph saying no to sleeping with the Pharaoh's wife. And, there's a concept of honor there. There's a lot of great morality in the story of Joseph that I really admire and look up to and got a lot out of. Anyways, ladies and gentlemen, those are my thoughts on the book of Genesis. Have you read the book of Genesis? If so, please comment below and tell me what you thought of it. And as always, ladies and gentlemen, if you like this video, please like it and subscribe. Tell your friends about the channel. And never forget to